The woman who sold fruits by the roadside was actually a missing queen. The old soldier dropped his walking stick in the middle of Afon Market and began to weep. Nobody had ever seen Sergeant Igbebuike cry. Not when his son died of fever, not when the flood took his barn, but on that dry Eke morning, in front of a woman selling oranges and garden eggs under a faded umbrella, the old man fell to his knees in the red dust and pressed his forehead to the ground. Ugo Nem, my mistress, my queen, you are alive. The market went silent. Ijeoma froze, with an orange still in her hand. 3 questions rose in that silence, and every trader, every child, every buyer standing near that stall would carry them home that evening, turning them over like stones in the calm. Who was Sergeant Igbebuike calling a queen? Why did the woman who had swept this very stretch of road for 11 years suddenly look as though the earth had opened beneath her feet? And why, when the old man reached for her hand, did she snatch it back and say, in a voice that did not sound like the Ijeoma anyone knew, "You have mistaken me for someone else. Please, get up before you shame yourself." Nobody believed her. Not really. Because a woman who has been mistaken for someone else does not shake the way Ijeoma was shaking. She does not pale under skin the color of roasted cocoa. She does not glance just once toward the bush path behind her store like a woman looks when she is already calculating how fast she could disappear into it. By nightfall, 3 different versions of the story traveled to 3 different villages. In one version, Ijeoma was a witch who had cursed the old soldier's mind. In another, she was a runaway wife hiding from a wealthy husband. In the third, the version that would prove closest to the truth, though nobody yet believed it, she was royalty. Nobody in Amaudo had ever asked Ijeoma where she came from. That was the unspoken rule of the road. People arrived at roadside market the way rain arrived, suddenly, without explanation, and you did not question rain, you simply built your roof to keep it out or let it in. 11 years ago, Ijeoma walked into Amaudo with nothing but a wrapper tied across her chest, a small girl asleep on her back, and enough silver coins sewn into her hem to rent a mud room from Mama Nkechi for one dry season. She had not cried when she arrived. She had not smiled either. She had simply put down her load, greeted the women fetching water at the stream in flawless Igbo that carried the faint music of a dialect nobody in Amaudo could place, and asked where she might find a spot to sell. By the 2nd year, her stall was the best stocked in the market. Oranges so sweet children fought over the peels, garden eggs arranged like a painter had touched them, plantains that never seemed to spoil before they sold. By the 5th year, she had built a small block house with her own money, adopted a motherless girl named Chiamaka, whom she found sick and abandoned near the church, and become the woman other mothers pointed to when they wanted to teach their daughters what quiet dignity looked like. She never remarried. She never spoke of a husband living or dead. When the pastor's wife once pressed her gently about her past, Ijeoma had only said, "Some doors, once you close them, you nail them shut so the wind cannot open them by mistake." The pastor's wife never asked again. Nobody in Amaudo had ever seen her cry until the day the borehole committee tried to force widows off their farmland, and Ijeoma stood in the village square, a woman with no husband and no title anyone knew of, and argued the elders into reversing their decision using land law language none of them expected a fruit seller to know. Nobody thought to ask where she had learned to speak that way, with the calm, unshakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. They only remembered that the widows kept their farmland and that Ijeoma never explained herself, and that the following week she was back at her store as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Children loved her most of all. She kept a small clay pot of roasted groundnuts under her table, not for sale, and any child who greeted her properly in the mornings, Ndewo, Mama Ijeoma, with a small bow the way their own mothers taught them, received a handful before school. She never scolded loudly. She had a way of lowering her voice when a child misbehaved that somehow frightened them more than shouting ever could. An old habit, though none of them knew it, from a woman who had once commanded a household of nervous servants with nothing more than a quiet word. She taught herself over the years to walk differently. Shoulders rounded rather than straight, steps shorter, less certain, the deliberate posture of a woman who did not wish to be looked at twice. She taught herself to laugh at jokes that were not particularly funny, to lower her eyes at the right moment, to let her Igbo carry the flatter, more common rhythms of the village, rather than the layered formal cadences she had grown up speaking in a palace nursery. 11 years of careful unlearning, built one small gesture at a time, so that a woman raised to enter rooms as though she owned them could instead disappear into a market crowd and never once be noticed. There was one habit, however, she never fully unlearned. Every new moon, without fail, she closed her stall an hour early, walked 2 miles beyond the village boundary to a small unmarked grave beneath an udala tree, and sat there until the sky darkened completely. She told anyone who asked that an old friend was buried there. She never told anyone, not even Chiamaka, that the grave was empty, a marker she had built herself in her 2nd year in Amaudo for the queen she believed she had killed the night she ran. She went there to mourn a version of herself she assumed was gone forever, never once suspecting that the woman she buried beneath that Odala tree would one day be resurrected by an old soldier's tears in the middle of a crowded market. That was the woman the village knew. The woman who knelt beside the weeping soldier that Eke morning, gripping his shoulders and begging him in a whisper only he could hear, "Please, in the name of everything you swore to protect, do not speak that name again," was someone else entirely. Someone with a title, someone with enemies, someone the entire market was about to meet for the first time.
3 weeks before Sergeant Igwebuike collapsed at her stall, a black convoy of 3 vehicles had rolled slowly through Amaudo on its way to somewhere else. Amaudo was not a place important men stopped. It was a resting point, a place to buy roasted corn and stretch cramped eggs before continuing the long road toward the coast. The convoy belonged to the royal house of Igwe, a kingdom 3 days' journey from Amaudo, known even in songs sung at distant moonlight gatherings, a kingdom whose old king had vanished 25 years earlier under circumstances nobody outside the palace fully understood, and whose queen had disappeared this same week, accused, tried in absence, and declared a traitor to the throne. In the back seat of the second vehicle sat a young man named Kelechi, 26 years old, dressed simply though his bearing gave him away, the straight spine of a boy raised to enter rooms as though he owned them. He was the crown prince of Igweocha, though he wore the title uneasily like a borrowed cloak 2 sizes too large. He had asked to stop in Amaudo for one reason only. He wanted roasted corn from a roadside seller, the way his tutor once described eating it as a boy before palace life swallowed every simple pleasure. It was, on the surface, nothing more than a young royal's small rebellion against ceremony. He bought his roasted corn from a boy near the market entrance, peeled back the husk with the eager clumsiness of a man unaccustomed to eating anything with his own hands rather than a servant's careful preparation, and burnt his fingers twice before his guards, suppressing smiles, showed him how the village children held the cob without wincing. For a few unguarded minutes, standing in the dust and noise of an ordinary market day, the crown prince of Igueocha simply looked like any young man enjoying an afternoon away from duty, laughing at his own clumsiness, waving off his guards' offers to peel the corn for him, asking the boy who sold it where he had learned to roast it so evenly over open coals. He did not know that his mother was selling oranges 4 stalls away. He would not know it for many more weeks. But Sergeant Igwebuike, riding as his personal guard that day, knew immediately. He had been the man who trained the Queen's private guard 25 years earlier. He had carried the infant Prince Kelechi in his own arms the night the palace burned with accusation and fear. And when his eyes fell on the fruit seller wiping sweat from the back of her wrist, a gesture he had watched 1,000 times from a respectful distance in another life, his old heart nearly stopped in his chest. He said nothing that day. He was too disciplined, too frightened of what discovery might unleash to speak in front of the young prince. He only watched her from the vehicle window until the convoy pulled away. And that night, unable to sleep, he made a decision that would shatter 11 years of careful silence. He would go back alone, just to be certain his eyes had not deceived him. Ijeoma had recognized him instantly too, the moment his convoy passed her stall 3 weeks earlier. Though she had said nothing, done nothing, only gripped the edge of her table until her knuckles paled, and prayed, silently, desperately, that his eyes would pass over her the way eyes pass over any ordinary roadside woman. For 3 weeks, she had told herself she imagined it. She told herself old soldiers did not travel with royal convoys anymore, that time changes faces, that fear invents ghosts when none exist. Then he returned alone on an Eke morning, and fear became something worse, certainty. That night, after the market closed, Ijeoma sat with Chiamaka in their small blockhouse, staring at a wooden box she had not opened in 11 years. Chiamaka, now 16, watched her mother's hand tremble as she finally lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded wrapper of deep royal blue, edged with faded gold thread. Beneath it, a small ivory bangle carved with the crest of a leopard beneath 2 crossed staffs, the mark of Igueocha's royal house. And beneath that, wrapped in cloth soft with age, a single photograph cracked at one corner of a younger Ijeoma standing beside a tall man in ceremonial dress, a baby cradled between them, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Chiamaka had heard fragments of Ijeoma's past before, in the careful, half-answered way children learn to accept the silences their parents build around certain rooms. She knew her adopted mother had arrived in Amaudo with almost nothing. She knew there was a husband once, though Ijeoma never confirmed whether he was dead or simply gone. She had learned very early not to press, because the one time she had asked directly, as a curious 8-year-old, why Ijeoma sometimes cried in her sleep, Ijeoma had gone so pale and so silent that Chiamaka never asked again, choosing instead to simply hold her hand a little tighter on the night her mother's breathing turned ragged in the dark. She remembered too the day Ijeoma found her, 6 years old, feverish, curled against the cold steps of the village church, abandoned by relatives who could not afford another mouth to feed after her own mother died in childbirth. Ijeoma had not hesitated. She had lifted the sick, frightened girl into her arms as though she had been waiting for her specifically, carried her the full 2 miles home, and sat beside her bed for 3 straight nights until the fever finally broke. She had never once, in the 10 years since, treated Chiamaka anything less than her own blood. And Chiamaka, in turn, had never once doubted that whatever mystery lived behind her mother's careful silences, it did not change the truth of the woman who raised her. "Mama," Chiamaka whispered, staring at the photograph. "Who is that man? Who is that baby?" Ijeoma did not answer for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight she had never heard in it before. "That man was my husband. That baby was my son. And the woman in that photograph has been dead for 11 years, Chiamaka. I killed her myself the night I ran." To understand why a queen would bury herself alive in her own name, you must first understand what happened in Igueocha 25 years earlier. Though even now, what the whole kingdom believed happened and what actually happened were two very different stories. The official story, the one carved into royal records and repeated at every coronation anniversary since, was simple. King Ozurumba fell violently ill during a feast celebrating his son's naming ceremony. Physicians found poison in the royal wine. Guards found the poisoned twin vial hidden among Queen Amarachukwu's belongings. The queen fled the palace that same night with her infant son, and though the search parties combed 3 kingdoms for a full year, she was never found. She was declared a fugitive, stripped of her titles, and, because a throne cannot remain without an heir present, her infant son was eventually recovered from a relative's home 8 months later, malnourished and abandoned, and raised within the palace as though her mother had simply vanished from history.
The regent who guided the kingdom through that crisis, and who had remained its most powerful voice ever since, was the king's younger brother, Chief Ozoemena. That was the story everyone in Igueocha believed. It was not, however, the story Ijeoma remembered living. She remembered a feast where she drank from the very same royal wine and felt nothing because the poison had never touched the general cask, only a single cup, prepared and delivered to the king's hand by a servant she did not recognize, on the direct instruction, she later discovered, of Ozoemena's most trusted priest, a man everyone called Eze Na, keeper of the ancestral shrine and interpreter of the god's will. She remembered waking that night to guards pounding on her chamber door, remembered Ozoemena's face, grief-stricken in public, cold as river stone the one moment they were alone, telling her that unless she disappeared that very hour, both she and her infant son would be executed by morning for the stability of the kingdom. She remembered believing in her panic that her husband was already dead. She remembered running. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that her husband was not dead at all. The second week after Sergeant Igwebuike's collapse in the market, Amaudo village changed in ways that made even the oldest residents uneasy. Strangers began appearing. A man claiming to sell farming tools who never sold anything, only watched Ijeoma's stall from across the road for hours at a time. A woman who asked too many casual questions at the well about the fruit seller with the fine manners. One night, Ijeoma's stall was found overturned before dawn. Oranges scattered and crushed across the road, her wooden signboard split clean in two, though nothing was stolen. The pastor's wife called it thieves. The market women called it jealousy from a rival trader. One trader, a sharp-tongued woman named Mamauju, who had never quite forgiven Ijeoma for having the best-selling stall 11 years running, went further, muttering to anyone who would listen that a woman with royal blood hiding among common traders brings nothing but trouble to honest people, as though Ijeoma's silence for over a decade had somehow been a personal insult rather than a matter of survival. Ijeoma said nothing in her own defense.
She had learned long ago that explaining herself to suspicion rarely changed its mind, and that the people who truly mattered, Mama Nkechi, Chiamaka, the mothers whose daughters she had quietly mentored for years, needed no explanation at all. Only Ijeoma understood the overturned stall for what it truly was, a warning, sent by people who had finally confirmed what Sergeant Igwebuike already suspected, and who wanted her gone before that confirmation reached anyone who mattered. She began sleeping with a kitchen knife beneath her pillow. She began walking Chiamaka to and from school herself, though the girl was old enough to walk alone. She began, for the first time in 11 years, to seriously consider running again. It was Sergeant Igwebuike who stopped her. He came to her house on a rain-soaked night, drenched to his bones, and stood outside her door refusing to leave until she let him speak. "They have already found you, Ugo Nem," he said, once she finally opened the door, his voice low and urgent. "Running again will not save you. It will only mean you die running instead of dying standing still. But there is something you do not know, something I only learned myself 2 years ago, when I was still close enough to the palace to hear what men whisper when they think no one loyal is listening." He told her that rain-soaked night, something that made Ijeoma sit down heavily on her own wooden stool, her hands pressed flat against her chest, as though to keep her heart from climbing out. King Ozurumba had not died that night 25 years ago. He had survived the poison, barely, and only because the physician who treated him was a man loyal not to Ozuemena, but to an older, quieter loyalty, the king himself, and the memory of a promise made between them as boys. That physician had smuggled the barely living king out of the palace in the chaos of the queen's disappearance, spread word among only his most trusted men that the king had died, and hidden Ozurumba in a remote monastery 3 kingdoms away, where he remained to this day, alive, aged, and utterly convinced, because he was told so, and because his wife never came looking, that his wife had poisoned him and abandoned his son to save herself. "He believes I betrayed him," Ijeoma whispered. "He has believed it for 25 years, Sergeant Igwebuike said gently. "And your son believes his mother is a traitor who ran and never once looked back. Ugo Nem, you did not only lose your throne that night, you lost your husband's trust, and you lost your son's love, and Ozuemena has spent every day since making certain neither of them ever learns the truth." The rain outside Ijeoma's window did not stop that night, and neither did the questions clawing at her chest. If her husband was alive, why had he never sent word, never searched, never once tried to find her in 25 years? Sergeant Igwebuike had no answer for that, only a guess spoken carefully, that perhaps a man convinced of his wife's betrayal does not search for the person he believes tried to kill him. Perhaps grief and shame had done what Ozuemena's schemes alone could not, kept 2 people who once loved each other permanently, deliberately apart. And if her son believed she had abandoned him, what would happen the day he learned the truth? Would he even want to know her? This woman who sold oranges and had a stranger's calluses on her palms? This woman who was by blood her mother, but who had missed every year of his life that mattered? Ijeoma did not sleep that night. She sat at her small table until dawn, staring at the cracked photograph from the wooden box, at the laughing young couple who no longer existed, at the baby that had grown into a crown prince without her. By morning, she had made a decision, though it frightened her more than anything she had done in 11 years of careful hiding.
She would not run again, but she would not walk blindly into the palace either, into Ozuemena's waiting hands, to be silenced the way she should have been silenced 25 years ago. She would find the truth herself, quietly, on her own terms, before anyone in Iguelcha knew she was coming. She began, that same week, by sending Sergeant Igwebuike back to the kingdom with careful instructions to find out everything he could about the physician who had saved the king, about whether Ezenna the priest still held influence, about whether Ozuemena's grip on the regency had ever been formally challenged. And she began, quietly, teaching Chiamaka things a mother teaches a daughter only when she suspects their life together is about to change forever. How to manage the stall alone, how to recognize danger before it announces itself, how to survive without her, if it ever came to that. The third week brought the first real turning point, and it arrived, as such things often do, from the last direction anyone expected. Prince Kelechi returned to Amaudo. He told his personal guard he wished to revisit the roadside market where he had eaten roasted corn weeks earlier, a small sentimental detour on his way back from a diplomatic visit to the coast. What he did not tell his guard, because he barely admitted it to himself, was that something about that market had been quietly eating at him since his first visit. A feeling, a face glimpsed for half a second among the stalls that had followed him home and refused to leave, though he could not say why. He wandered the market alone that afternoon, his guards trailing a respectful distance behind, until he found himself standing in front of a stall selling oranges, garden eggs, and plantains, arranged with a precision that felt absurdly like something out of a memory he did not know he had. Ijeoma's whole body went cold. This was not Sergeant Ikwebuike, a man old enough to recognize a face from 25 years past. This was her son, grown, a stranger, standing so close she could have reached across the table and touched his face, and he did not know her. He looked at her the way any customer looks at any trader, faint curiosity, nothing more, and something in Ijeoma's chest cracked so quietly that no one standing nearby could have heard it. "Good afternoon, ma," Kelechi said, his voice carrying the practiced politeness of a man raised to speak gently to strangers. "Your garden eggs, they are the finest I have seen on this whole road. May I ask, where did you learn to arrange a stall this way? It reminds me of something, I cannot say what." "A woman learns many things when she has had to build a life from nothing, my prince," Ijeoma said carefully, and the moment the words left her mouth, she realized her mistake. Kelechi's eyes sharpened. "You know who I am?" "The whole market knows who you are," Ijeoma said quickly, forcing a small laugh that felt like broken glass in her throat. "A convoy of such as yours does not pass through Amaudo without every mouth in the village discussing it for a week." He studied her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, then nodded slowly and bought far more oranges than any one man could carry, as though buying time rather than fruit. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Forgive me for asking something strange, ma. Do I remind you of someone?" Ijeoma's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the coins he had given her. "Every young man reminds an old woman of someone, my prince. That is simply what it means to grow old." He left with a small puzzled smile, glancing back twice before his convoy disappeared down the road, and Ijeoma sat down hard on her wooden stool, pressing both her hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She had just spoken to her son for the first time in 25 years, and he had called her Ma, the way any stranger addresses any woman selling fruit by the roadside. That night, for the first time since she fled the palace, Ijeoma allowed herself to cry. Not quietly, not carefully, but the full, shaking grief of a mother who has just discovered that her son grew into a good man without her, kind enough to compliment a stranger's fruit stand, gentle enough to ask forgiveness before asking a strange question, and utterly, completely lost to her. Chiamaka held her that night without asking questions, though she had many. She had guessed enough from the wooden box, from the whispered conversations with Sergeant Igweurike, from the tension that had gripped their household for weeks, that understood that her adopted mother's careful, ordinary life was unraveling, and that whatever came next would change everything.
"Mama," Chiamaka finally said, once Ijeoma's sobs had quieted, "if he is truly your son, does that not mean you should tell him? Should you not at least give him the choice of knowing? And if I tell him, and he chooses to believe the lies he was raised on instead of the truth from a stranger's mouth, I would not only lose him a second time, Chiamaka. I would hand Ozuemena the proof he needs to finally finish what he started 25 years ago. No, if I go to my son, it must be with truth strong enough that even his own doubt cannot argue against it." Sergeant Igwebuike returned from the kingdom 11 days later with information that arrived at exactly the right time and the worst possible moment, both at once. The physician who had saved the king was dead, 3 years gone, of old age, taking with him the exact location of Ozuromba's hiding place, though he had, before dying, entrusted a single sealed letter to a monastery priest with strict instruction to only be delivered to the queen herself should she ever be found alive. Ezenna, the priest who orchestrated the poisoning, was very much alive and had grown, if anything, more powerful, no longer merely a shrine keeper, but Ozuemena's closest advisor, whispering counsel into every major decision the regent made. And Ozuemena, it turned out, had never fully trusted that the queen was truly dead, despite 25 years of official silence. He had kept a network of quiet watchers stationed along every major road for over a decade, precisely for such a discovery as this one. Sergeant Igwebuike's visit to Amaudo and his collapse in the market had already been reported to that network. "They know Ugonnem," Sergeant Igwebuike said grimly. "I don't know how much, but they know something. We no longer have the luxury of choosing when this begins. It has already begun."
4 days later, at midnight, 3 men climbed the fence surrounding Ayama's small blockhouse. Chiamaka awoke first, some instinct honed by Ayoma's careful training over the previous weeks, pulling her from sleep the instant a floorboard creaked wrong. She screamed a warning half a second before the first man reached her door, and that half second, combined with Ayoma's steady hand and the kitchen mic she had slept beside for a month, was the only reason both women survived that night. Neighbors awoken by the commotion arrived with machetes and lanterns in time to see 2 of the intruders fleeing into the darkness and to help subdue the third, who, under Sergeant Igwebuike's furious and highly effective interrogation the following morning, confessed everything before the sun had fully risen. He had been sent by Chief Oziomena's personal enforcer, a cold, methodical man named Okonkwo, whose instructions had been simple: confirm the fruit seller's identity. If confirmed, silence her before she could confirm it to anyone else. Sergeant Igwebuike recognized the name the instant the frightened man spoke it. Okonkwo had once been a junior guard under his own command 25 years earlier, a quiet, ambitious young man who had transferred to Oziomena's household within weeks of the queen's disappearance, rising steadily through ranks that rewarded loyalty over conscience. He was never a cruel boy, Sergeant Igwebuike admitted quietly, once the intruder had been handed over to the village's own makeshift justice, tied to a mango tree to await the district police. He simply learnt very early which master paid better for silence than truth ever did. The village of Amaudo, which had spent 11 years believing Ijeoma to be nothing more than a quiet widow with excellent oranges, learnt that morning in the space of a single confession exactly who had been living among them. The reaction was not what Ijeoma feared. There was no mob, no accusation, no demand that she leave. Instead, an old woman named Mama Nkechi, the very woman who had rented Ijeoma her first mudroom 11 years earlier, walked to where Ijeoma stood trembling in her own compound and took both her hands. 11 years and you swept my brother's compound yourself when his leg was broken. 11 years and you never once let a child in this village go hungry on your account, queen or not queen.
Whatever storm is coming for you, my daughter, it will have to pass through all of us first. That was the moment, more than any other, that something inside Ijeoma finally began to unbend. The slow, painful realization that the family she had built in exile was not a lesser thing than the throne she had lost. It was perhaps the truer thing. But love from a village, however fierce, could not stop what was coming from the kingdom. Word reached Oziomena's palace within the week, not merely that a woman resembling the missing queen had been found, but that she had survived an assassination attempt and now stood openly acknowledged by an entire village, with Sergeant Igwebuike, a former royal guard, as her open protector. Silence was no longer a viable strategy. Denial would soon be impossible. Oziomena, ever the political survival, chose a different weapon entirely. He announced with great public ceremony that reports had reached him of a woman claiming, falsely he was certain, to be the long-vanished Queen Amarachukwu, and that in the interest of the kingdom's peace and the late king's memory, he would personally see this impostor brought before a formal identification council to be exposed for the fraud he was confident she would prove to be. It was on its surface an act of justice. In truth, it was a trap meticulously designed. The council, Sergeant Igwebuike warned, would be stacked entirely of Oziomena's loyalists. Ezenana would preside as spiritual witness, and Ezenana had spent 25 years perfecting the exact kind of ritual manipulation that could make an entire hall of witnesses believe whatever falsehood he wished them to believe. If Ijeoma refused to attend, she would be declared by default a confirmed impostor and fugitive, hunted openly for the rest of her life. If she attended, she would very likely be publicly humiliated, discredited, and, Sergeant Igwebuike did not need to say the rest aloud, quietly disposed of once the ceremony's usefulness ended. It was by any reasonable measure a trap no sane person should walk into. Ijeoma decided to walk into it anyway. "They have written the story of my death once already, Sergeant Igwebuike," she said quietly, packing the wooden box that had waited 11 years for this moment. "I will not give them the satisfaction of writing it twice while I hide behind a fruit store. If I am to lose everything, I would rather lose it standing in the light than hiding in the dark." The journey to Igweocha took 3 days, and Ijeoma spent every hour of it preparing not her defense, but her evidence. The ivory bangle bearing the royal crest, the photograph, and a set of old letters Sergeant Igwebuike had carefully preserved, written in the Queen's own hand to her ladies-in-waiting in the months before her disappearance. Letters whose handwriting no forger could easily replicate. She also carried something else. A quiet growing certainty that the physician's sealed letter, still waiting, unclaimed in a monastery 3 kingdoms distant, held something crucial enough to change everything, if only she could find a way to reach it before the council convened. She sent Sergeant Igwebuike ahead, alone and unseen, to retrieve it, while she and Chiamaka continued toward the capital with a small group of Amaudo villagers who had astonishingly insisted on accompanying her, Mama Nkechi foremost among them, declaring loudly to anyone who would listen that no queen of mine walks into a den of jackals without her people beside her. The entire Defecation Council convened on the 7th day in the great hall of Igweocha's palace, under banners bearing the leopard and cross staffs Ijeoma had not seen in 25 years. Oziomena sat at the center of the raised dais, older now, silver threading through his beard, his face arranged in an expression of sullen, righteous concern that fooled everyone in the hall except the one woman who remembered exactly what that same face had looked like the night he threatened to kill her infant son. Ezenana stood beside him, draped in ceremonial white, holding a carved staff whose tip glinted with cowries, the very picture of spiritual authority.
Then it was Ijeoma's turn to speak,
and the hall fell into the particular silence reserved for moments everyone present understands to be historic. She did not plead, she did not weep. She placed the ivory bangle, the photograph, and the preserved letters before the council, and she told them, in a voice that grew steadier with every sentence, the true story of the night she fled. Not the poisoning, which she had never committed, but the threat whispered to her by the man now sitting in judgment of her, the threat that had forced a terrified young mother to run into darkness with nothing but her infant son to protect. Oziomena predictably called it fiction. Ezenna predictably declared the ritual signs unfavorable to her claim, and for one terrible moment, watching the assembled nobles' faces shift toward doubt, exactly as Sergeant Igwebuike had warned they would, Ijeoma believed she had walked into her own execution after all. Then, from the back of the hall, a familiar cold voice spoke. Okonkwo, released quietly from Amaudo custody days earlier through a prisoner exchange Ijeoma had not been told about, and clearly summoned back to the capital ahead of her, stepped forward and declared to gasps across the chamber that he wished to withdraw his earlier confession. He had been coerced, he claimed, by an armed village mob and a former soldier with a personal grudge against the regency. He had never truly been sent to harm anyone. He had simply been investigating rumors in the loyal service of the crown. For a sickening moment, Ijeoma watched the council's sympathy tilt visibly in Oziomena's favor. An old soldier's testimony and a village collective memory suddenly weighed against the calm, rehearsed denial of a man in polished court dress, and polished court dress, she was reminded bitterly, had always carried more authority in that hall than truth alone ever could. Mama Nkechi, seated among the small group of Amaudo villagers permitted to observe, rose to her feet in fury, but the council's herald ordered her silenced before she could speak a single word in defense of the woman she had sheltered. It was, Ijeoma understood in that moment, precisely how Oziomena had survived 25 years at the center of every storm he created. Not through strength alone, but through the patient, practiced art of making truth look like accusation and accusation look like truth, for exactly as long as it took the room to forget which was which. Then the hall's great doors opened and Sergeant Igwebuike entered, breathless from hard travel, carrying a single sealed letter bearing the physician's unmistakable seal. The letter was read aloud by the council's eldest and most impartial member, an ancient nobleman with no particular loyalty towards Oziomena and nothing left to fear from him. It confirmed in the physician's own careful hand that King Ozurumba had survived the poisoning attempt 25 years earlier. It confirmed that the poison was placed in a single cup, not the general wine cask, meaning the queen, who had drunk freely from that same cask that night without ill effect, could not possibly have been its source. And it named explicitly the servant who delivered that single cup to the king's hand, a servant later identified through careful cross-reference with palace records Sergeant Igwebuike had also recovered as a young initiate under the direct authority of the shrine keeper, Ezenna. The hall erupted. Okonkwo, standing exposed in the center of the chamber with his hastily rehearsed denial now worthless, made one final calculation, the same calculation that had guided his entire career. Which master, in this new arrangement of power, was most likely to protect him? He turned without hesitation and pointed directly at Ezenna. It was the priest who gave the order to silence her, he said, his voice suddenly desperate, stripped of its earlier composure. Whether this was truth or simply the fastest available exit from a collapsing lie, Ijeoma never learned for certain. Okonkwo was quietly stripped of his position and exiled from court within the week, disappearing from the story as abruptly as he had entered it, one more man who built a career on choosing convenient loyalty over honest conscience, and lost everything the moment convenience ran out.
Ezena's composure shattered first, a flicker of pure panic crossing his face before he could master it. And that flicker, witnessed by every noble in the room, did more damage to his carefully constructed authority than any letter could alone. A man who spends decades convincing others that the gods speak through him cannot afford even once to look afraid of an ordinary human accusation. The moment the assembled nobles saw genuine fear rather than serene spiritual confidence cross his face, 25 years of manufactured authority collapsed in the space of a single breath, and no ritual staff or ceremonial robe could gather it back up again. Ijeoma, sensing the tide turning with the instinct of a man who survived 25 years of political maneuvering, immediately attempted to distance himself, expressing shock, demanding the priest be questioned, positioning himself as equally deceived rather than complicit. It was, in its own way, a second betrayal, Ijeoma abandoning the very man who served him loyally for a quarter-century the instant that loyalty became inconvenient. But the letter contained one final revelation, saved by the physician, it seemed, precisely for a moment such as this one. King Ozurumba was alive. The physician's letter gave in careful detail the location of the monastery where he had spent 25 years in hiding, believing his wife a traitor, unaware that the very brother he trusted to guard his kingdom had orchestrated the plot that separated them both from everything they loved. The retrieval of King Ozurumba took 11 more days, and those 11 days changed the political shape of Igweocha entirely. Ijeoma, stripped of his regency by unanimous council vote the very afternoon the letter was read, was placed under formal house arrest pending full investigation, though several nobles, Ijeoma noted, with a bitterness she did not try to hide, argued privately that a man of his stature deserved quiet retirement rather than public trial. A mercy that made her wonder, not for the first time, how much true justice a throne could ever actually deliver. Ezena fled the capital the same night his role was exposed and was never formally caught. Word reached the palace 6 months later that he had died of illness in a distant province, having evaded every consequence but the one no man escapes. Ijeoma felt no triumph at that news, only a hollow, complicated grief, for the justice that would now never fully arrive, for the years his schemes had stolen that no trial could ever return. But the reunion that mattered most to her happened quietly, away from council halls and political maneuvering, in a small monastery courtyard where an aged grey-bearded man sat exactly where he had sat for 25 years, believing himself forgotten by the wife he still, despite everything, had never quite managed to stop loving.
When Ozurumba saw her, he did not speak for a long time. He simply looked at her, this woman aged by 2.5 decades of hard, ordinary labor, so different from the young queen he remembered, and yet unmistakably, achingly the same, and something in his weathered face crumpled entirely. "I told myself you had chosen to run rather than explain yourself to me," he finally said, his voice breaking on every word. 25 years, Amarachukwu. I told myself that story every single day, because the alternative, that you had run to save our son's life while I lay dying, believing yourself abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect you, I could not bear to consider it. It was easier to believe you guilty than to imagine what you must have suffered if you were innocent. "I do not blame you for believing what you are told," Ijeoma said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. "We were both handed the same lie from 2 different directions, my husband. It cost us 25 years, neither of us can ever reclaim." They stood together in that courtyard for a long time, 2 people who once loved each other completely, now separated not only by physical years, but by 2.5 decades of entirely separate lives, entirely separate griefs, entirely separate people they had each quietly become in the other's absence. "Tell me about him," Ozurumba said eventually, lowering himself onto a stone bench worn smooth by decades of quiet monastery mornings.
Our son. I have only ever known him through a stranger's letters, sent twice a year by a monastery brother with a cousin in the capital. I know he is tall. I know he governs well, they tell me. I do not know what makes him laugh. I do not know if he takes his tea the way I once did, too sweet, the way my own mother scolded me for. He arranges royal fruit displays the way your mother once taught the palace kitchens to arrange them, Ijeoma said softly, surprising herself with the small, unguarded smile that came with the memory. Ozurumba's eyes filled, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, only reached for her hand the way he had reached for it 1,000 times in another life. And this time, though her fingers hesitated, she did not pull away. I do not know how to be your husband again, he admitted quietly. 25 years is a long time to grieve a woman I now learn I never should have grieved at all. I do not know this new version of you, the one who built a house with her own hands and taught a village's daughters what dignity looks like. I am not certain that man is entitled to simply reappear and ask for what he lost. Then do not ask for it, Ijeoma said. Ask instead whether it is possible to build something new between two people who are no longer the same two people who once stood beside each other in a wedding wrapper, laughing at something outside a photograph's frame. That, I think, is a question worth answering slowly, however it ends. The reunion the whole kingdom would later celebrate as a triumphant restoration was, in that private courtyard, something far quieter and far more complicated. Relief tangled inseparably with mourning for everything the years had already taken and could never give back. The reunion with Kelechi was, in its own way, harder still. He had watched the entire council hearing in near silence, his face unreadable, and he did not approach Ijeoma in the days following the revelation, though Sergeant Igwebuke assured her the prince had spent those days locked away with the old palace records, reading every document related to his mother's disappearance that Ozoemena's regime had never fully managed to destroy. When he finally came to her, it was alone in the small guest chamber the council had granted her, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. I spent 25 years being told my mother chose the throne's safety over mine, that she poisoned my father and left me to be found half-starved in a stranger's house because raising me herself was too dangerous for her own survival. I built an entire understanding of myself around that story, madam, around being the son a mother abandoned. I know, and I cannot give you back the years that story cost you, or the years it cost me watching you grow from a market stall, unable to say a single true word to you. I do not expect you to call me mother simply because a council hall now agrees I am entitled to the word. That is not something a hearing can restore. It is something, if it is possible at all, that we would have to build slowly, the same way I built a life for myself in Amaudo, one small true thing at a time. There is something you should know, Kelechi said, after a long silence, his voice quieter now, stripped of the formal distance he had carried into the room. When I was small, before I understood any of the politics around me, I used to dream of a woman's voice singing something I could never quite remember when I woke up. Ozoemena's household told me it was a servant's lullaby, nothing more, and I believed them because there was no reason not to. I stopped having that dream around the time I turned 12. I had almost forgotten it entirely until the week you first spoke to me across your fruit stall. It came back that same night, clearer than it had been in 14 years. Ijeoma's breath caught. She had sung to him every night of his short infancy, an old lullaby her own mother once sang to her, half in Igbo, half in words so old she no longer remembered their original meaning. She began hesitantly to hum the first few notes, unsure if her voice would even remember the tune after 25 silent years. Kelechi went very still. Then slowly his composed royal bearing cracked for the first time she had known him anything other than a stranger, and he sat down heavily in the chamber's single wooden chair, pressing both hands over his face.
I have spent 25 years being told that woman abandoned me, he said, his voice thick, and my body remembered her voice before my mind ever agreed to believe she existed at all. Keliti studied her for a long time, the same searching look he had given her weeks earlier over a stall of oranges, before something in his shoulders finally eased, not into full forgiveness, not yet, but into something honest enough to begin with. The garden eggs, he said, and for the first time, something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. You arranged them the way my grandmother once arranged palace fruit displays for royal feasts, according to the old records I found this week. I did not know why it felt familiar to me that day. Some part of me must have known, even then, before the rest of me was ready to believe.
The final revelation, the one that recontextualized in a single sentence everything the kingdom had believed for 25 years, came not from the council, and not from Ozuemena, who maintained until his quiet death under house arrest 2 years later that he had only ever wanted stability for the throne, but from an old letter Ijeoma discovered among Ezena's abandoned shrine records, retrieved by Sergeant Igwebuke in the chaos following the priest's flight. It revealed that the plot to poison King Ozurumba had never truly been Ozuemena's idea at all. Ezena had orchestrated it from the beginning, manipulating a younger, more easily led Ozuemena with false prophecies and manufactured omens, convincing him over years of careful whispering that the gods themselves demanded the throne pass through his hand rather than his brother's, that Ozurumba's rule displeased the ancestors, that only Ozuemena's regency could save the kingdom from spiritual ruin. Ozuemena, the letter suggested, had believed, at least at first, at least partially, that he was fulfilling a sacred duty rather than committing a simple, brutal act of betrayal. It did not excuse what he had done. It did not return a single one of the 25 years stolen. But it meant that the story the kingdom believed, a simple tale of a greedy brother and a treacherous wife, had never been the true story at all. The true story was of an old, patient manipulator who had spent decades quietly reshaping an entire kingdom's history to serve ambitions that outlived even his own death, using other people's hands to do it. Ijeoma read that final letter alone late at night and felt no satisfaction in it, only a tired, aching clarity, the understanding that the people who suffer most in stories like hers are rarely the ones who orchestrate the harm, and that uncovering the truth, however necessary, rarely feels like victory. It feels, mostly, like finally being allowed to put down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was possible to stand without it. The council formally restored Ijeoma's title 6 weeks after the hearing, alongside a ceremony reinstating King Ozurumba, frail but alive, to a throne he insisted within months on passing directly to Kelechi, declaring himself too changed by 25 years of exile to properly govern the kingdom he no longer fully recognized. The whole of Iguelcha celebrated for 3 days. Drummers filled the capital streets. Elders spoke of prophecy fulfilled, of a queen restored, of justice finally arrived after a quarter-century of waiting. Masquerades danced through the market square, where 25 years earlier, criers had once announced her as a fugitive to be captured on sight. Old women who remembered her wedding wrapper wept openly, embracing strangers in the crowd, and children too young to understand any of the politics simply enjoyed the free meat pies handed out at every compound gate. It was, by every outward measure, the triumphant ending such stories are supposed to have. Ijeoma stood on the palace balcony during the final evening of celebration, Chiamaka beside her, in a new wrapper the palace tailors had insisted on making. Sergeant Igwebuke standing at a respectful distance behind them both, finally permitted, after 25 years of quiet exile from the household he had once served, to wear his old ceremonial uniform again. She watched the drummers below, the dancing crowds, the fireworks borrowed from a coastal trader specially for the occasion, and felt something she had not expected to feel amid so much noise and color. Loneliness. Not because anyone around her had failed her. Ozurumba stood at her side through most of that evening, careful and gentle in a way that suggested he too was still learning the shape of the man he wanted to become for her. Kelechi addressed the crowd as their new king with a steadiness that filled her with pride, so sharp it nearly took her breath away. But amid the drumming and the borrowed fireworks, she found herself thinking unexpectedly of Mama Nkechi's smaller, quieter compound back in Amaudo, of the particular sound rain made against her blockhouse's tin roof, of Ijeoma's laughter at the dinner table on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing historic was happening at all. And she understood, watching the palace she had once called home glittering beneath her, that a piece of her heart had already, irreversibly, relocated somewhere else. But triumph, Ijeoma had learned, does not erase what came before it. And the ending she chose for herself in the months that followed surprised the entire kingdom far more than the revelations that led to it. She did not remain in the palace. She attended the coronation. She stood beside Ozurumba as the crown passed formally to her son, and she wept, genuine, unguarded tears, as Kelechi, now truly her son in every sense that mattered, took his father's crown with a steadiness that told her, more than any reunion conversation could, that the boy she had carried into darkness 25 years earlier had grown into exactly the kind of man she would have wanted to raise, even without her. But when the ceremonies ended, when the drummers packed away their instruments and the visiting dignitaries returned to their own kingdoms, Ijeoma quietly informed the new king, her son, that she intended to return to Amaudo. "The palace gave me back my name," she told him, on the morning she left, Chiamaka standing loyally beside her, Sergeant Igwebuke waiting with the small cart that would carry them home. "Amaudo gave me back my life, at a time when I had nothing left to build one with. Mama Nkechi rented me a room when I had only silver coins and a frightened infant girl on my back. An entire village armed itself with machetes to protect a woman they only just learned was royalty, because for 11 years before that, she had simply been their neighbor. I cannot repay a debt like that by disappearing into a palace the moment my name is restored." Kelechi did not argue. He had perhaps expected this answer, some quiet understanding having grown between them over the past few weeks that his mother was not, and perhaps had never truly been, a woman built for palace life alone. "Then I will visit Amaudo as often as a king is permitted to visit his mother's orange store, and you will visit the palace when you are ready, not as a fugitive summoned to a hearing, but as a queen who chooses to come." Ijeoma returned to Amaudo 3 months after the coronation, and the roadside store reopened the following Eke market day. Though it looked different now, a small carved plaque beside the oranges, gifted by the new king, marking it with wry royal humor as the finest fruit stand in 3 kingdoms by official decree. She did not sell fruit every day anymore. Some weeks she traveled to Igweocha, sat in council sessions as an advisor her son valued more than any title required her to be, visited her husband, whose health remained fragile, but whose company slowly, carefully, over many quiet months, began to feel less like mourning a life that ended and more like discovering who 2 changed people might still become to each other, even now,
even after everything.
But she always returned to Amaudo, to Mama Nkechi's compound, where she still helped sweep when the old woman's knees ached too much to manage alone, to the small block house, where Chiamaka, now enrolled in a proper school with royal sponsorship she had firmly negotiated on the girl's behalf, still came home each evening to sit with the woman who had saved her from the church steps and never once let her believe, not even for a single day, that being motherless meant being unloved. The kingdom remembered her, in the years that followed, as the queen who returned, a story told at coronations and moonlight gatherings alike, of truth uncovered after 25 years of silence, of a throne restored to the family that rightfully held it. But in Amaudo, on ordinary Eke mornings, when the market women gathered to gossip and children ran between stalls chasing roasted corn, she was remembered as something simpler, something the village had known long before any royal convoy ever passed through its dusty road. She was the woman who arranged her garden eggs like a painter, who never let a hungry child leave her stall empty-handed, who built a whole life from nothing with silver coins sewn into a wrapper's hem and a frightened infant girl asleep on her back. She had lost 25 years to a lie told by men who wanted a throne more than they wanted the truth. She had found in the wreckage of that loss a village that loved her without needing to know her name, a daughter who chose her freely rather than being born to her, and a son who learnt, slowly and honestly, to call her mother again, not because a council decreed it, but because she had earned it one small truth at a time. It was not the ending anyone in Iguocha's old songs would have predicted for a missing queen. There was no triumphant march back to a throne she never truly wanted to reclaim for herself. There was no clean justice for every person who had wronged her, and some wounds, the years Ozoromba spent believing her a traitor, the childhood Kelechi spent believing himself abandoned, the quarter-century Azenna's schemes had quietly stolen from an entire kingdom, never fully healed, no matter how many titles were restored or how many drummers filled the capital's streets. Ozayamena himself lived out his remaining 2 years under quiet house arrest in a modest wing of the very palace he had once ruled as regent, visited occasionally by a son he had estranged decades earlier through his own ambition and by no one else. When word of his death reached Amaudo, Ijeoma sat with it for a long while, expecting some rush of vindication that never fully arrived. What she felt instead was the tiredness of setting down a load carried so long her shoulders had forgotten what it meant to walk without it. She did not attend his burial. She sent instead a short note to Kelechi, reminding her son that whatever grief he carried for the uncle who also, in his own broken way, helped raise him, was his alone to feel, and that she would not ask him to hate a man simply because she could not find it in herself to forgive him either. Some evenings, long after the market closed, and Chiamaka had gone off to study by lantern light for the examinations that would, in a few more years, carry her toward a university far grander than anything Amaudo had ever produced, Ijeoma still walked the 2 miles to the Udaala tree, beneath which she had once buried a version of herself she believed dead. She no longer went there to mourn. She went instead simply to sit, to watch the sky change color, the way it had changed every evening for 11 quiet years before a soldier's tears in a crowded market rewrote everything she thought she understood about her own life. But on quiet Eke mornings, watching Chiamaka arrange plantains at the stall beside her, watching travelers stop to ask with growing recognition whether this was truly the market where the missing queen still sold her own fruit with her own hands, Ijeoma understood something she would have laughed at 25 years earlier as a young queen who believed a crown was the only thing worth protecting. Some crowns, she had learned, are worn on the head. Others are built quietly over 11 patient years out of oranges and garden eggs and a stranger's kindness in a village that never once asked her to prove who she was before deciding she belonged. Both, she had come to believe, were worth protecting. She had simply needed to lose one completely and rebuild it from nothing to finally understand the true value of the other. Travelers still stop at that market sometimes, drawn by rumor rather than direction, asking the nearest trader to point them toward the store where a queen once sold oranges with her own hands. The traders always oblige, though most of them, if you ask quietly enough, will admit the same thing Mama Nkechi once said to a trembling woman standing in her own compound 11 years into a life built entirely from silence. Queen or not queen, she was theirs first, and a village does not forget the ones who chose to stay.